for it. All right, Jean, ready for you.
Good evening, everyone, and I'm glad to be here with you. I'd like to begin tonight's talk on storytelling and the importance of storytelling in the spiritual life of children, but in our spiritual life as well, by sharing a reflection by Charles O'Donnell. It's called In the Upper Room. What did you hear last night, your head on his breast there? It was Peter in the dark supper room asking of John, who with Mary his mother was just returned from burying him. I heard his blood moving like an unborn child and his heart crying. I heard him talking with his father and the dove. I heard an undertone of the sea swinging and a whispering at its center. I listened and all the sound was a murmuring of names. I heard my own name beating in his blood and yours, Peter, and all of you. And I heard Judas and the names of all that have been or shall be to the last day. And it was his blood was calling out these names, and they possessed his blood. Did you hear my name? Asked a woman who was sitting at his mother's feet. I heard your name, Mary of Magdala, and it was like a storm at sea and the waves racing. I heard Peter's name, and the sea broke, I thought, and ran over the world. You heard then the name of Mary, his mother, Peter said quietly as he wept there kneeling. I did, and it was like the singing of winds, and they moving over an ocean of stars, and every star like a hushed child sleeping. Again, Peter, what of Iscariot? I heard the tide come in, and I felt the tide go out, and I saw a dead man washed up on the shore. And then John fell to weeping, and no one could comfort him, but only Mary, the mother of Jesus. And he could tell them no other word. So here we have the disciples in the upper room after the crucifixion. They're confused, they're afraid. Their world has been turned upside down. They didn't expect things to turn out this way. They remember that John was leaning against the breast of Jesus. They know rather, that John is the best friend of Jesus. And they need to hear John's story because they need to try to begin making sense of everything that's happened in the last couple of days. Human beings, regardless of who we are, need stories. We need stories for the same reason that the disciples needed stories. We need to make sense of this world around us. We need stories to get ourselves out of ourselves, and especially these days in this culture of me, 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 me. And I am the center of my own universe, and it's my truth. And my world, that's the most important. We need to get out of that mentality. And when we do, we find out what we have in common with other people. We find out that our experiences, many of them, are universal experiences. We find out that our emotions, our thoughts, our concerns, our worries, are shared by other people. We find out, C.S. Lewis said through stories, that we're not alone. We live in an age of social media. We live in an age where we're so connected like no other, as in no other period of history, but we're so much alone. Think of the experience last year, and for some schools this year, of the isolation of children in front of screens. It's not the same. This talk is not the same as it would be if I were standing in front of you. First of all, I'd be bouncing all around, but it's just not the same. The dynamic's not the same because I can see a few people, but being in another's presence and hearing the stories, being in another's presence and sharing what you have to share, is a very different phenomenon. We know that children love stories. You read that quote from Eudora Welty that I used to sort of make a synopsis of what I was going to talk about tonight. And she talks about sitting at the feet of elders and listening for stories, not listening to stories, but waiting for the stories to naturally emerge. She wasn't sitting there, and Eudora Welty, is a brilliant writer. She wasn't sitting there waiting or demanding, tell me a story. She compared it to a mouse coming out of his hole. She's waiting for those natural stories to emerge from the conversation, as they do for all of us whenever we're talking to other people. It's hard to get through a conversation and not tell a story, because we need to share that which is deepest in us. And there's a quote, which of course I'm not going to remember, from Alice in Wonderland, so I'll paraphrase it. At one point, one of the characters says something to the effect of, "Oh, adventures first, explanations take too long." And it's much more exciting to have the adventure than it is to listen to an explanation of something. We need to provide experiences for our own children with time to sit at the feet of elders. And I'm going to tell you a few stories in this little talk tonight. At the last school that I was at, I was there for 30 years. One of the things that it was a school of Polish ancestry, and we were still very much Slavic in our traditions. Of the school traditions, but my background is Irish, and I had to bring some of myself into it. So St. Patrick's Day became a very big feast. It hadn't been. And we did all sorts of things with the Trinity and explaining the life of St. Patrick and the missionary spirit and all of that. We also built leprechaun traps. So in the mornings with the whole school, we were fortunate that the church and the school were one building. So the whole school gathered in prayer, preschool to 8th grade, every morning. And then we'd have a little morning meeting if there was school news. So in the morning meeting, I was telling them what they were going to do the next day, which was St. Patrick's Day, in their big buddy, little buddy partners. And now you have to realize, while this was a school of Polish ancestry, most of the kids in front of me were Portuguese, because Fall River is a heavily Portuguese city. Some from Brazil, some from the Azores, and some who were first or second generation. So I'm talking about leprechaun traps and leprechauns, and I suddenly realized these children have no cultural experience of this at all. And I'm getting some kind of blank stares, which was a little unusual. So I began on the spot to make up the story of Seamus the leprechaun, who stowed away in my grandmother's steamer trunk when she came over from Ireland. And the kids started to lean forth in their seats. Their eyes were wider and wider and wider. So of course my story got bigger and bigger. But once they heard about Seamus the leprechaun, they were building a leprechaun trap to capture Seamus. They didn't want any other leprechaun. They wanted Seamus. So they all built their leprechaun traps. They set them up the night before. And I, of course, went around and seeded the traps and, did things in the room so it looked like leprechauns had been there. But I left a very small hat that I'd shown them in the morning that I had said came from Seamus. And I said, every St. Patrick's Day, he tries to steal it, but he's not going to get it this year. I'm going to lock it away in my office, but I left it in one of the traps. And I could hear from the office the screaming when they found Seamus's hat. He was in our room. So my story, based very loosely on stories I heard as a child, became their story. And every year they were going to capture Seamus. Now, some of my story of Seamus involved things that Seamus did, mischievous things. So when certain mischievous things began to happen throughout the year in the school, silly little things, and I would try to find out who did it, and we need to have a conversation here. Seamus was often the answer. So kind of like the not me in your houses, I think. But the story became, for the children, part of their world and part of the way to sort of understand the magical, mystical side of Ireland, and children love stories about fairies and all of that. But I never would have been able to make up that story on the spot had I not spent my childhood at the feet of elders, listening to the stories that they told, listening to their life experience, listening to the legends, listening to the folklore. I never realized, it's probably about my 15th year of teaching, that I realized exactly how important that experience had been for me. My classroom was located, it was a lovely classroom, but it was in the basement of the school at that particular time. And there was a flood. So we had to move up from April to June to the gymnasium, cafeteria, parish hall. It was a multi-purpose room, and we got half of it. So we had to do all sorts of creative things on gym days and all of that. But Wednesday mornings was pierogi making day for the parish because we had Polish food sales all the time, which meant that half of the gym was filled with our elderly parishioners making Polish food, a delightful group. I'm trying to teach on the other side of the gym. I started off regularly. Then I said, okay, kids, I'm going to pull the microphone. And once they hear me speaking over the microphone, they'll realize I need to teach and they'll quiet down. Mm. So I started over the microphone. They just got louder. The folks making the food. And again, very delightful people. So we made a quick other plan with the kids and we got through that day. And I had to sort of plan a new way that they would be doing independent work and conferencing with me individually on Wednesday mornings. That worked for 1 week. And then the pierogi makers started to drift over to my side of the gym. Oh, what are you working on? Oh, I can help you with that. I went to this school. You people don't know how lucky you are. The bathroom was in the basement and the only water fountain was in the basement. It really wasn't a fountain, it was a bucket and we had to use a ladle. And they would go on and tell these fabulous stories. Then they would start to tell about their experiences, because I taught history, they would start to tell about their experiences in the armed forces, or what they remembered of World War II being on the home front. We had one gentleman, Mike, who was for many years stationed at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And that kind of brought the war home to the kids, and that brought history home to the kids. And I thought, wow, I've been an idiot. I used to love the stories that I heard. There was nothing I liked more than sitting and listening to stories. And I haven't taken advantage of this rich resource we have, nor have I been sharing my stories with the kids. So my teaching really changed up with that. And as my teaching changed, so did the students. Reflections became much, much deeper. Behaviors changed. Kids became more understanding of other kids. It was really a fascinating time for me. In the Irish culture, there's the storyteller is always called the Shawnee, and there are traveling storytellers who move from town to town. Not so much anymore, but the tradition still exists. So I think as a family, it's important to identify who are the storytellers. Who are they? Who are the ones who do it well? Who are the ones who hold that family treasure of lore and history? And we need to find ways to help our children sit at their feet and listen for those stories, wait for the stories to come out. When we share family lore with our children, they become rooted. They understand that there are people in the past and one of the reasons they're here is because of those people in the past. And there's going to be a great Aunt Matilda who did the same kinds of things that I like to do. And there was a great Uncle Michael who had red hair, and I'm the only person in the family who has red hair now. They're going to really develop in their souls a deeper connection with their family. And for those of you who might have 7th and 8th graders, I will tell you, when they roll their eyes and say, I heard that story before, Dad, tell it anyway. Because at lunchtime here, and it's where I am tonight in the classroom, this is not a fake blackboard, it's my blackboard. When they're here at lunchtime, they share those stories. I know more about you folks than you could possibly imagine, those of you who have children in my classes, because they're sharing your stories, and they're sharing them as if they were their own. Now, of course, at the 7th and 8th levels, my dad is so crazy, you'll never believe what he did. And the story, and then, oh, wait, you think that's crazy? Before my parents were married, so the kids wasn't even there, right? Before my parents were married, my mother said my dad did XYZ, you know, and my dad went skiing the day before the wedding and he almost broke his leg, and my mother was bad, and all kinds of things like that. They tell your stories, and they tell them as if they're their own, and they tell them proudly and affectionately. Bit of a competition to see whose dad is the craziest, or whose mom is the strictest, but they're becoming deeper and deeper and more deeply connected with the family. And that becomes important because in middle school, they're beginning to find their own identity. In high school, you will have some issues because there has to be that separation of, you know, I belong to this family, but I am a person and I am becoming an adult, and we need to have conversations about that, Mom and Dad. So it's important that you tell your stories as well. The stories that the children hear, whether they're your stories or stories from literature or oral stories that have been handed down, they're helping them to rehearse for life's happenings. Brain research tells us that when we listen to a story or read a story, the same parts of our brain are responding as would be responding and active as if we were when we were going through the same experience. So third grade rather is going to start Heidi next week. So as Heidi is climbing that mountain to meet her grandfather for the first time, and as she's already heard in the village stories about the Alm uncle, who is her grandfather, and how mean he is and how horrible he is, and she's climbing that mountain, the kids who are hearing that story are going to be feeling the same thing as if they were Heidi. When they watch Clara finally overcome, or they hear Clara finally overcome her fear and her grief and begin to get out of that wheelchair and begin to walk, they're going to learn something about coping with fear and grief because those same areas of their brain are being activated. There's a lot of talk these days, and I'm not poo-pooing it, but there's a lot of talk these days about emotional intelligence. I prefer to think of the life of the soul. If we are feeding the children's souls, if we're feeding our own souls, then things like emotional intelligence are naturally developed. Things like the virtues, and that very important thing called resilience that our children are going to need more than we can even imagine in the world that they're going to be moving into. All of those are naturally developing. So what kinds of stories do they need to hear besides the family stories? They need to hear heroes, the stories about heroes, but stories about villains as well. They need to hear the stories from the Bible. Who are we imitating when we're sharing our stories? Jesus himself. They need to hear stories of saints and sinners who have converted and become saints. They need to be away with the fairies at times. They need to hear stories of adventures, adventures that are realistic and adventures that are fantasy. They need to hear both nonfiction and fiction. They need to hear the stories that you loved as a child. Because good stories don't grow old, good stories don't become irrelevant. They need to take on memories from these stories, whether it's the stories from literature, stories from history, your own stories. They need to take on memories that will fortify them and that they can return to. And that you can return to when they come to you and they're troubled. Remember how we read about Clara. Remember how that grief imprisoned her. We don't want you to be imprisoned by what you're experiencing now. So let's talk about what Clara did. Let's talk about how she got out of that. We're preparing them to get through the tough times that we all know are coming. The stories that we're teaching them, or we're telling them rather, should teach them that good always overcomes evil, that the knights of God defeat the demons every time. Often that defeat has to come after a very brave and noble struggle, but come it will. From the stories that teach the virtues, and I don't mean that it overtly teaches a virtue, but we see the virtues building in the characters. Children learn that real courage is to put one step in front of the other and face whatever is coming for the day. And persevere in putting one foot in front of the other, even if it's only a half step and it's followed by 2 steps backward. Because they learn that trust in God is what propels them, what keeps them moving, what prevents them from sitting down and giving up. One of the reasons that I wanted to read is all of the movies take out what Johanna Spyri considered the most important part of her story. They may be beautifully filmed, the story may be told, the basic story. Almost every single version of Heidi, except there's one German one that was made in 1952, they take out God. But if you can remember reading the original Heidi when you were a child, if you did read it, God permeates that book deliberately on the author's part, because she does not feel that anyone can move forward without God. Mm-hmm. She does not feel that any good that's out there is coming from a human, even though they're acting good, even though Heidi is very virtuous. The good is coming from their relationship with the divine. The good is coming because they know their place in God's world. So we're looking for our children through these stories to see the world around us as an outpouring of God's love, and to see themselves as an outpouring of God's love. What's one way you can foster that particular thing? Do they know the story of their baptismal day? On their baptismal anniversary, do you sit down as a family and talk about the baptismal, pull out the photos, because you're all young enough to have photos. I think there's only one of mine. But you pull out the photos and talk about what the day was like. Talk about how you felt as a parent. If you can have the godparents over then or around at the time, let the godparents share with them how they felt. Do they know the story of their birthday? I do, because my father every birthday would say, I don't know the whole thing, but my father every birthday would say, your mother waited until I was the unexpected child. I have brothers. Your mother waited until the last minute, and I thought I was going to have to pull the car over to the side of the road. You were born as soon as we got into that hospital. And I only know, my mother never told me that. I only know because of my father. But I remember the story, you know, when I looked, despite the fact that I knew it, you know, I knew my father was going to tell it every year, and he did. So we want them to know about the special moments that they can't possibly have in their memory. And I often think how special it is for those families who converted later on. I am deeply grateful that I'm a cradle Catholic, but for those families that converted later on, when the children could experience it with parents and they have that shared memory, what a precious thing, I think, what a precious gift. There was a Carthusian monk in the Middle Ages named Guigo II, and just because I like his name, I like to quote him. But Guigo II was the one who coined the term Lectio Divina. And he was the one who split Lectio Divina, kind of labeled its parts, and explained to his fellow Carthusians in a book that he wrote called The Ladder for Monks, how to do Lectio Divina. But I like what he says about the reading part. And obviously he's talking about reading sacred scripture and sacred texts at that time. But I think it applies to reading and storytelling for us as Catholics. He says, reading looks for the sweetness of the life of blessedness. Reading looks for the sweetness of the life of blessedness. And isn't that what we want our children to feel? Yeah. There's so much negative stuff out there. And I'm not, you know, Miss Positivity, I'm no Pollyanna, but as anyone who knows me can tell you. But I can see the blessedness in life. I can see those very graced moments. And that's the vision that we need our children to develop. That's the vision that gets me through the hard days. That's the vision that's going to get them through the hard times. You know as well as I do that persecution has started and it's just going to get a lot worse. And we don't know when it's going to end, but we know that it's going to be deep and it's going to be hard. And whether our children are going on to other Catholic schools, whether our children are going on to public schools, wherever they may be going when they get out of here or get out of high school or get out of college, they're going to be facing people who do not hold the same values. And not only that, people who hold them in contempt because of their Catholic faith. We need to arm them with virtues. We need to arm them with resilience. We need to arm them with a deep relationship with God so that they can survive, they can remain Catholics. So we've talked about, you know, where do you start with all this? We've talked about sharing your stories, they're very important. Read alouds as a family are fabulous. And if you have older kids, have them do the read aloud. When we were, this summer when we were doing all of that reorganizing, there was one day when there were seemingly 1 million children here in a very hot gym. And I was organizing books on the side. And Kim was very graciously keeping most of the children away because I couldn't hear them and be hot and organize these books, and they were all little, and it was quite the scene. But one little one who brand new to the school, hadn't even been here, was starting kindergarten, came up to me and she said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm organizing books." And she said, "Oh." And she recognized the cover to the Chronicles of Narnia. She said, "I know that book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe." Now this child's 5. I thought, "Oh, that's pretty good." I said, "You do?" She said, "Yes, I'm reading that right now." I said, "Well then." And she said, "Well, to tell the truth, my sister's reading it to me." But she could tell me the story. She loved it. She loved the fact that her sister was reading the book aloud. She loved the fact that they were reading it as a family. So use your older kids to do the read alouds. And especially if you're not comfortable telling stories, yourself, you'll become more comfortable, but the read alouds are a good choice. There's a book I would recommend. It's an older book, but it's called Books Children Love. These are clean books. These are books that are not going to have children talking back to their parents all of the time. These are books that are not going to have sarcastic children. These are books that are going to have real children going through real adventures, fictional children going through fictional adventures, but the values are values that you want to inculcate in your children. And she divides, this is Elizabeth Wilson is her name, who compiled this list of books. She divides it into categories. So no matter what your child is interested in, there's a category for them. Animals, art and architecture, Bible, spiritual and moral teaching, biographies, celebration days and seasons, crafts, hobbies, and domestic arts, dance, drama, and other performances, growing plants, history and geography, humor, language, and then 3 levels of literature. Half the book is about literature. And then she even has a mathematics category and a miscellaneous category, music, nature, science, all kinds of stuff. So you will find books that your children will love from this book. And because it's an older book, most of these books will be available at the library as well, once you get this particular book. And you can get used copies of this on Amazon or Alibris or any of those sites. So if you're looking for a resource to kind of find stories, this is a very good one. The other thing that, and I'll have Kim send out this link in my notes this week, but the other thing I would recommend that you subscribe to is a once a week newsletter. They call it a magazine, but it's really just a page or two, called Jasper, that Dr. Anthony Esselin writes out of Magdalen College in New Hampshire. And it's truly, it's an email that comes once a week. Sometimes it's a story that he's written or a story that he's retelling. Sometimes it's about a virtue. Sometimes it's about a particular word, and he kind of goes off on the particular word. He is not, for those of you who are like me, fans of Dr. Esselin and are used to reading his material for adults, he is not sarcastic in this newsletter, or very rarely. He has a wonderful, sarcastic, ironic tone in his writings for adults that really bring home the point that he's trying to make. But he's really a very good writer. I would really recommend subscribing to that. It's free. That will also give you a starting point for talking to your kids. And it is geared to families. So those are some areas, but the important thing is, however you can make yourself be comfortable exposing your kids to more stories, do that. There's no right or wrong way to do it. There's good and bad literature, but this will help you with that. But no right or wrong way to do it. Just share your stories, expose them to good stories, and you're going to build up for them the armor of God, if we want to quote St. Paul. So there we are.
Oh, thank you. Hold on, let me